Let's see. So should the Constitution include an overall crime code specifying crimes and punishments that could apply throughout the United States? Why or why not? I know I've read them. I know that we too. You want to volunteer what their thoughts are on that? So we have a Constitution that lays out a framework for our set of ideas or set of laws. Should our Constitution lay out all the laws? Or not?
No.
No?
No.
Why?
Because then there's no way to do lenient or anything.
So if we talk about sentencing, sure, yeah, there'd be no way. If the Constitution laid out mandatory sentencing, sure. States do that though, right? States have mandatory minimum sentences. The federal law has mandatory minimum sentences for instance, certain narcotics crimes. If you have over 20 kilos of a certain amount of narcotic, then you shall be sentenced to this amount. No leeway. It's out of the judge's hands. So what's the difference between the Constitution and that?
More so that that's in a situation where their drug is harder and they just want it off the street.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm talking about more so of just the personal privileges.
Oh, okay. So less the criminal aspect of things, but
Right.
the rights and freedoms.
Right.
Do we have certain regions of this country that are more prone to liberty versus regulation?
Yes.
Yeah. We're more county universities where if you were to go to like China or Japan or something, they would be.
Absolutely, other countries. But what about within our own Constitution? So Washington State and North Carolina are both under the same United States Constitution. California and Texas under the same United States Constitution. They have their own state constitution. Are historically or traditionally, are some areas more prone to freedom versus regulation within that same constitution though?
I believe so, and I like my analysis. That was, you go to, I don't know what state it is, but some state who nudist camps are legal. You can't walk around here naked.
So you get the freedom to express that nudist viewpoint. What about guns? I mean, we'll talk about something just real tangible. Are some states, is it easier to purchase a firearm than other states? So that would be an incident of, for example, of regulation versus freedom. The Constitution doesn't talk about, I mean, I've read it a couple times and I've never seen anything in the Constitution about a 10-day waiting period to buy a gun. It's not in there. But some states you have to wait 10 days. Some places like North Carolina, if you don't have a CCW permit, you gotta go get permission letter from the sheriff. In the Constitution, I've never read anything that says that the sheriff has to give you permission to buy a gun. So
That part's under extortion anyway.
cost you $5 to buy a gun in Johnson County. $5 plus a $3
But look at
convenience fee.
Look at the revenue that it made off of that. That's the reason why it's been put in to get rid of the physical purchase permit in the state of North Carolina, but we won't do it because of revenue.
A lot of decisions are made based on revenue.
Most decisions are made on revenue.
Because the government doesn't have a product per se to sell, and so raising prices could be equivalent to raising taxes. It could be a similar thought. What are some other examples of that? What do you think? Can you give me an example of? Because I don't disagree with you.
Building permit. You want to build a shop on your property, you can't do it without a permit. If you do it without a permit, you're not going to be able to pass inspection. You can't pass inspection, you can't get power. You can't get power, you're screwed overall.
So to break that down, he's talking about building permits. You want to build a building on your property. The government has decided, either the local or the state government has decided that you must ask for permission and inspection to build something on your property. In theory, what is the outside of what we're talking about, the revenue portion? Why do you think you need to ask for them to come look at that building to make sure it's a legal building?
I'm sure it's hidden in the guise of safety and everything like that, but bottom line is it's about money.
Right. So at some point, in theory, if I was able to build a house willy-nilly, me personally, not even hypothetically, I would not be able to build a safe house. a house that is going to be safe to live in. It would take me a lot of YouTube videos to do it. I couldn't just do it on my own. So the government doesn't trust me to build a home. However, now you're talking about revenue versus safety. Does it cost money to build, to ask them for permission? That's where I think that's what I'm picking up is, should it cost money? Should you have to pay for the right to have them come inspect your building? That seems to be where the controversy lies. As far as the root of it, the whole regulation in general is put in place for, like you said, either, if you believe it or not, for safety. Like, you're supposed to make sure that in this case, we don't want just anybody building a home because people could get hurt. Now, what you pointed out was that one, you have to purchase the permit to do it, and then otherwise you can't get an inspection, things like that. So that line that is drawn between revenue and safety, I can see could often be blurred. And that's just one example of freedom versus regulation. And then you have contention of over-regulation. One of the examples I've used, we talk about minor codified laws like municipal codes. One of the examples I use is that in Los Angeles, they had some regulation that said, regulatory decisions that said signage has to be only a certain size for a building. Or you couldn't have certain signage on your glass window if you owned a business. Is that safety? Is there safety in how big your sign can be for your building, or not saying you can't paint your windows with a going out of business sale, or annual going out of business sale?
I think more that's more aesthetic than anything. They want everything to be uniform and nobody to stand out.
More regulation to do that. And at some point, if that continues, if those decisions continue, then it becomes a claim of over regulation. People are going to feel burdened by the amount of regulation. But as we discussed before, there's also extreme. If you have no regulation, then you have people like me building a house. So there's got to be a happy medium. The TSA was another example we used. If you have no regulation when flying, then people can bring guns, knives, llamas, horses, alligators onto a plane because nobody can stop. There's no law. So I can do whatever I want. I'm flying. But at some point they said, you know what? Maybe don't bring a llama with you when you're flying. And somebody else said, I'm not really cool with you bringing a stick of dynamite with you when you fly in. And then with all the hijacking, maybe don't bring a gun with you when you're flying. And at some point, there are more and more laws, more and more regulations. But then at what point does it become too much? At what point did people stop saying, well, I don't really want them patting me down anymore. I don't want them touching me. I don't want them going through these scanners where they can see me naked. I don't want them going through my pockets. Because you could be 100% safe on every flight. All we have to do is just consent to every time we fly that you get strip searched and you have a cavity search and they search all your pockets with your clothes taken off. Right? They will never, ever, ever bring any weapons on a plane that way, right? We cannot, if they do a cavity search on you every single time you fly and force you to get naked and strip search you, then we have to do it to them too.
Exactly.
If every single person gets on a plane, it's strip search and cavity search and all their clothes are searched, then we're 100% safe. So why don't we do that? If we know that we're going to be 100% doing that, why don't we just do that now?
Other countries have tried.
You infringing on our privacy.
It's a sacrifice of freedom for safety, which has never really worked.
So there's a balance. At some point, it's too much. So if I'm hearing, it's too much for most people to agree to get naked and have a cavity search and have their clothes searched while it's off their person. That's just too much. But it's also too much to have the plane blow up because you can let anybody bring a bomb on. So somewhere in the middle is going to be a societal balance. Like yours. Say that again, please.
The sacrifice of safety, sacrifice of freedom for safety.
There you have to, if we're going to let people bring bombs and alligators and guns and llamas with no regulation, then we have all the freedom we want. We got complete freedom, and we got chaos and turkeys running up and down the aisle. But we have all the freedom we want. But planes could blow up because people under their arm with not even trying to hide it. They're just bringing a big old stacks of dynamite because I need this dynamite where I'm going. Because there's no regulation. But over here, we got everybody completely safe, but nobody has any freedom. And that's the balance that we need to, as a society, we need to come up with. But I would venture to say in this classroom, there are differing levels of where that balance lies. Some people are going to be closer to, I want everything on the plane, and I don't care how unsafe it is because I want my freedom. And some people might be all the way extreme. I want zero laws. I want to do anything I want to do, and I don't care about any kind of regulation. Could be. And some people are more comfortable with more regulation. Some people are more comfortable with a lot of regulation. Saying, maybe that whole strip search thing isn't so bad. At least I'm safe. Some people might feel that way. It is very difficult in a society as large as ours to have a consensus on the amount of liberty versus regulation. And that's where you'll see some of, that's why we have different political parties, different leanings, different ideologies, because there are differing opinions on what should, that's just one of the differing opinions of political ideologies. Oh my eye. So I used the word earlier that I want to make sure that you guys know, because we're going to hear it all semester long. I use the word codified. As we define our laws, what used to be English common law, it was just commonly held, passed down verbally. Before that, we had the very first codified law, but they weren't very common. Hammurabi's Code, or the Code of Hammurabi, was the very first codified law. And when I say that word codified, it just means it's written down. So our laws today are not common law. Any law you want to know is written down someplace for us. And now, with computer, internet, phone, you could find any law in seconds. So that's what we're gonna, as we use that term codified, this means written down. So it's gonna be codified in codes. I talked about the Code of Hammurabi. We have codes today. To define that, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. The codes are going to be, for lack of a better word, the books that we write in. Our criminal laws, for the most part, most jurisdictions, are going to be written down in penal codes. But our criminal laws can be diversified into other things outside of the penal code. For instance, our vehicle code says how fast you can drive, says you have to register your car, things like that. We have codes like labor codes that say how long you can work. We have health and safety codes that define the possession of narcotics. Welfare and institution codes that would define when somebody can be involuntarily held for mental illness. So these are all codified laws. There's a law that says you can't punch somebody in the face. It's just written down someplace. And I don't have it memorized in North Carolina, but in California, 242 of the Penal Code says you can't punch somebody in the face. That's bad. 243 says that you can't punch your significant other. 211 says you can't rob somebody. 245 says you can't shoot at them. 187, what does that say? Can't kill him. Unlawful. Who's ever heard of the term 5150? You know what it means? Yeah, it's an involuntary hold for mental illness. That comes from California, the Welfare and Institutions Code. 5150 of the Welfare and Institutions Code says you can involuntary hold somebody. I'm sorry, Roger. No. That's what that term. Have you ever heard that term? Song lyrics, country song 5150. Those are all codified laws. But those are, and I'll make sure we're reviewing the types of laws as well. If you were going to label this section of your notes, types of laws. So those are criminal laws for the most part. 5150 is not, but what I talked about, battery, 245 is like an assault with a deadly weapon, and you don't need those numbers. I'm just using those examples. But those codified laws that we discussed before that are criminal codes. it is criminal to possess narcotics unlawfully. It is criminal, as Brandon holds the opinion, that it is criminal to kill someone. It is criminal to shoot at people in general. However, not all laws are criminal laws. We have another set of laws. We usually bifurcate our laws into two. In this particular example, so we have criminal laws. What's the other kind? Civil, exactly. Civil and criminal. Let's talk about civil law. Civil law, we're going to break that down into making someone whole. If you are wronged or someone is wronged, at some point they need to be made whole. Doesn't mean you're going to go to jail for it, just means that you wronged somebody, so we need to make them whole. For instance, if you hire somebody who doesn't know how to build a house, if you hire me to build a house and I don't do a very good job and it falls down and hurts you, now you can't work. You hired me. Whose fault is it that the house fell down? Mine. I wronged you in this scenario. How are you going to be made whole? What can we? How can we make this right?
Monetary.
If you can't work, then maybe you need some money to pay your bills. So whoever has that wrong, whoever is at fault in this, is going to have to pay those bills. Things like that. I mean, that's obviously a very very watered down scenario. But that doesn't mean that, I'm gonna get to that in a second. So if you are wronged and the court, you initiate a suit, a civil action, and the court finds, yes, absolutely, this person was in the wrong, then that person can be made to pay monetary damages for that wronging to make the other party whole. Now, even though we have two sides of law, I want to kind of touch on double jeopardy. Somebody define double jeopardy.
Double jeopardy is being charged for the same charge of being taken to court for the same things you've already been acquitted for.
Absolutely. So, or even that you've been found guilty. You can't be charged twice at all, right, in general, right? So, the extreme example, if Brandon holds this strange opinion, he believes that it's wrong to commit murder. So, if somebody is charged with murder, and he said they were found they were acquitted for it, they're found not guilty, and then later we find out more evidence, can we charge them for murder again with this new evidence?
No.
Powerful,
You have to put them
strong
out.
I'd have to be a new charge.
Yeah.
Find a new charge, yeah. Regardless of the evidence, in general, you missed it. As the people, as the prosecutor, as public, you missed your chance. Should have had all the evidence the first time, because there's no going back. You can't, just because there's new evidence. For instance, we'll use me in this scenario. If I'm charged with murder and I'm found not guilty after the trial, they just didn't have enough evidence to acquit it. It's close. They just didn't have enough evidence to find me guilty. And then as soon as I found not guilty, I walk out on the courtroom steps and I give a press conference talking about, I knew I was innocent. I knew I'd be found innocent. I've been vindicated, which is funny because I did it. And here's a picture of me doing it. Here's a video of me doing it. And here's a signed confession. And here's I've got 50 people who watch me do it. Nobody, they never called witnesses. I bet they wish they had this video of me doing it. Can I be rearrested and tried for that case?
No.
Oh, I mean, that's some great evidence. I cannot be tried for that crime again, even with that evidence. However, there's some exceptions there and some workarounds. Perhaps I can't be charged with that crime, but maybe I wasn't charged with the assault crimes or the ADW crimes or lying to the police crimes. You know, there's some other workarounds. I can't be charged with that crime. But in some other classes, I've shown videos of that, not exact scenario, but somebody found not guilty of murder. I think it was a sexual assault and a murder case where they were found not guilty, and then later there were literal videos and pictures showing them doing it. And even though they couldn't be charged with that murder, in that case, I believe they were, it was like a multi homicide, but they were only charged with one, so they just charged them together. Homicide, things like that. There's workarounds. Yes, ma'am.
But was the other thing when they did him, wasn't he first acquitted or something, and he wrote the book, and then they, did the civil suit him as well?
Boom! It was like you read my lesson plan.
Oh.
So What she said was, what about OJ, where he was found not guilty at the criminal trial, but then there was some sort of civil action? So let's talk about that. There is nothing that precludes a civil action after a criminal case. For instance, if Joey Schmuckatelli is driving down the street drunk and crashes into you, is driving drunk against the law? Yeah. Is it also against the law to hurt somebody in a crash while drunk? Yeah. There's a criminal law that says that if you crash into somebody and hurt them, well, it's two different laws. It's illegal to crash when you're drunk. It's illegal to hurt somebody when you're drunk. There's different things. It's also criminal to drive and not crash. All that being said, that can Joey Schmuckatelli be arrested for the drunk driving and be arrested for the enhancement of causing injury while in a collision while drunk? Sure. When it's all said and done, Joey Schmuckatelli can go to jail. But where does that leave you? You were crashed into. You got no car anymore. Maybe you're injured and you can't work. Should you still have the right, even though that Joey was found guilty of the drunk driving, should you have the right to be made whole for that, or are you just out of luck? Absolutely. So it's not double jeopardy. It's two different codes, two different types of law, completely bifurcated. You have the criminal aspect and the civil aspect. And while they're not necessarily intertwined, one can be civilly liable after being found criminally liable. And that's what the example you used with the OJ case. OJ was found not guilty for the homicides, but then was found liable for the wrongful death. Similar actions, civil actions caused it. Similar evidence, I'm sure. I didn't watch the civil trial. But one was found guilty, or excuse me, one was found not guilty and one was found liable. Because in civil law, we don't get found guilty. But let's talk about that double jeopardy just a little bit more. What about, excuse me, Rodney King? You guys remember the Rodney King case? It's a long time ago, 1991, I believe. You guys know what town that was in?
California.
It was in California. It was in Los Angeles. A lot of folks think that the Rodney King incident happened in South Los Angeles, and did not. It happened about as far north in Los Angeles as you can get. So the officers who were involved in that case were arrested and put on trial for some California Penal Code violations. I don't remember exactly what they were, but there were some color of law type violations that the law says you can't do what you did. You remember what the result of that trial was?
They was acquitted.
They were acquitted. However, the federal government said that's not good enough. Even though you're acquitted of these California penal codes, there are also some federal laws that you violated. We're going to try you for that. Is that double jeopardy? Same behavior. They're trying on those behaviors. Now, if there are more than one law, if you got more laws
That's all we did.
that fall under different headings, different categories, you try it over and over. For instance, the example I used, if somebody is suspected of killing 3 people and the prosecutor is just not sure how the trial is going to play out, they don't have to charge them with all 3 murders.
I'm gonna come back with a million.
Charge them with 1 murder. See how the trial goes. And then if things go well, you can try them again. For the other murder, it's a new law. That was the example that I used previously. So those are the 2 types of law, criminal and civil, that we're going to talk about in this section. The other type of civil action is not necessarily to be made whole in injury, but contracts. That same example where I said you hire me to build a house, you pay me to build the house to buy all the supplies. I say I need 50% up front. So give me all the money that I need to start buying the supplies, and then I just leave. Have you been wronged? You're out money. I didn't hurt you. I didn't, injure you physically, but you've been civilly injured. Your money's missing. So how do you get made whole? Get your money back. That's also civil action. Going back to the Constitution. Constitution was written by people, well, in this case specifically men, but people, humans that are fallible, humans that can make errors. It was determined after the original Constitution was written that there were probably some things left out that shouldn't have been. So we needed to amend our Constitution. That's where you get that term, amendments. The first 10 of those realizations, the first 10 of those amendments, we all lumped together usually, and even in this class, we'll talk about them lumped together, call those the Bill of Rights. Amendments like the First Amendment that give you protections from the government against stopping your speech or stopping one from assembling or participating in their religion as they see fit. The Second Amendment that was previously mentioned, the right to bear arms, things like that. So we have 10 originally, they came out fairly shortly thereafter. 10 decisions that, hey, maybe we should add something to the Constitution. Overall, I want to hear a couple guesses as to how many times it has been proposed to make an amendment. Any ideas? How many times have people proposed, hey, I think this should be added to the Constitution? I can't hear it alone. Give me a number. Like 50? Anybody else? We can look at two other guesses. Don't matter. Who's at 50? Come on, beer. Chris? I'm sorry? 40? Okay. And then your penance for tardiness will be your last one. You said 50? 60, 40, 50, and 60. We're going in the right direction. 7,000. 7,000 times. More, a little over 7,000 actually. 7,000 times people have said, you know, I think we need to add something to the Constitution. This was a little easier. How many times has everybody agreed? Or how many times has it happened? 27. 27. If I were going to write down a number today, I'd write down 27. 27 amendments. 27 times. 33 times there's been an initial agreement. Yeah, we should put this to the states, but only 27 of those, the states have agreed. 7,000 times. The most recent time, you know, people think about amendments. The most recent time was 1992. Yeah, 1992. I'll date myself. So it wasn't, you know, we're not talking, it happened in the 1700s, or they initially did happen in the 1800s. But the most recent time somebody said we need to change the Constitution was when I was in high school. Like, it may seem like 92 is a long time ago for some things, but if you think about the Constitution being changed, that's surprising. That's an interesting story. That was that last 27th Amendment was almost a goof. There was just a guy who found this. There's 7,000 chances to change the Constitution, and if they're not voted on, they just stay on the books. They just, you know, not as law, but they're just documented. Like, this is a proposal, never got voted on or never got passed. It just stays as a proposal. He found one that he thought was legitimate, and really started lobbying the legislators and saying, "Hey, we need to pass that." In this case, the one that he saw was so legislators get paid, right? They get paychecks. Legislators also determine when federal raises occur. Legislators are federal employees, so legislators vote for their own raises.
It's like checking your own homework, though, isn't it?
A little bit. So there was a proposal that said, if a legislative body is going to vote on their own raise, that raise shouldn't go into effect until the next session when new legislators are elected. Does that make sense? I mean, does that seem fair? You can't just give yourself a raise willy-nilly. Essentially, when you're voting for a raise, you're voting for the next people's raise, unless you're reelected. And that's what we proposed. It was staying on the books for 201 years or something like that. And finally, this guy who saw it gentleman from Texas, I believe, saw it and started lobbying his legislators, and they eventually passed it. I'm almost positive it was like 1991. 27th Amendment. You can't, any votes that go, any legislative phrases that go into effect, that are voted in place, go into effect in the next session. That's part of the Constitution now. One thing I want to touch on, and then I get back to the Constitution, but I want to make sure that you, for your notes for criminal and civil law. We have a threshold by which we prove our cases, and it's different on each one of those. We've all heard the term beyond reasonable doubt, which is to say that a prosecutor, if they're going to charge someone with a crime, has to be able to prove that case, not just beyond any doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, there could be some kind of crazy alien explanation for it, but that's not reasonable. So the law says you have to prove criminal cases beyond a reasonable doubt. However, proving civil cases is a lot lower of a threshold. The preponderance of the evidence. You want to put a number to that? You know, is it more than likely that it happened? Is it 51%? 50% in a feather, some people say. Just over 50%. That probably occurred. I feel like every time I look in that corner, I see more and more bottles. I feel like I'm slipping them out there one by one.
Long class.
I've heard me talk. I know. So that, yeah, make sure we understand the difference. Civil law goes by the threshold of preponderance of the evidence, and criminal law by reasonable doubt. So before we get too far away from that. Talk about the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment. Off the top of your head, anybody got any ideas on the 13th? It's a big one.
Something to do with the states. With, oh God.
Abraham Lincoln had a lot to do with it. It was abolishing slavery. So what happened? We realized we wrote this Constitution that said all men are created equal, and all types of equality talk. But then, even after that, there was still the advent, or not certainly not the advent, it existed before our country, but implementation of slavery in our country. So we got a Constitution that says all men are created equal, and then we've got people that are enslaved. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, but I would say like, I mean, we have the Constitution, but then we have to do this compromise inside of it.
That was case law, but
Right.
yeah, freedom of compromise was not codified within our Constitution, but case law discussed it. So we have a conflict there. We have a conflict that says we've got freedoms, we got all men created equal protection, law, things like that, and then we've got people that are enslaved not being treated equally. So we needed to amend our Constitution, and that's what happened with the 13th Amendment. But we have the 14th Amendment, which says what? He said so the 14th literally follows the 13th, but it has a follow-up to it. Why? Ms. Scott, you mentioned it?
After the Civil War? Okay, no.
If the 13th Amendment talked about abolishing slavery, if we've abolished slavery, so we've got a whole bunch of folks that are here against their will, and now not slaves. Do you think that everybody just picked up and said, "Hey, welcome to America. You're one of us now. Come on down. Have a seat right here next to me. And we'll all go to the same restaurants, we'll all go to the same churches, we'll all go to the same schools." Is that as soon as the 13th Amendment was ratified, is that how the thing went down?
No.
Rainbows and butterflies?
No.
Exactly. There are some challenges with equality still. So folks were not enslaved anymore. However, life wasn't that great when you couldn't go to the same schools. You couldn't, just most obvious. Once somebody's a free slave, were they a citizen of the United States? No. You don't have to, just here, but not a citizen. The 14th Amendment said that if you were If you're here, born here, naturalized, you can be a citizen. So it kind of encompasses, it was initially encompassing the slavery aspect, but now taken to mean through case law that if one is born here, regardless of the origin or citizenship status of their parents, they're eligible to be a U.S. citizen. The 14th Amendment discusses naturalization and the ability to be a citizen, based primarily on repairing some challenges that faced the country with the abolishment of slavery, because just like I said, just because we abolished slavery didn't mean everything's rainbows and butterflies. So we have a body that reviews a lot of these legislative changes. As a reminder, we have 3 branches of government. The executive branch, which is our president, vice president, law enforcement, attorney general, things like that. The legislative branch, which makes our laws, writes our laws, Congress, the Senate, the House of Representatives. Then we have a judicial branch. Our judicial branch has the criminal aspect or courts, but we talk about the Supreme Court. When we talk about how the 3 work together in checks and balances to make sure that the other 2 aren't getting too out of line, there is something very specific that the Supreme Court does that not all lower courts do. And that is, they do exactly that. They do the checking for the legislative branch and the executive. The Supreme Court has the right to review these laws. If Congress decides we're going to write a law that says nobody can own guns anymore, they can do that. They can write that law. If they want, if you get everybody in Congress agreeing, hey, we don't like guns, we're going to make every gun illegal, and we can say people just can't own it. Do you believe me that Congress can write a law like that?
Do they have the ability?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
What stops them from doing it then?
Because the
A
blood,
couple things stop them.
because the tree of liberty needs to be fed by the blood of tyrants and patriots.
So one, folks wouldn't love them, right? They would not be elected if they believe that. However, under the umbrella of constitutional law and outside of legislative elections, they also couldn't do it. Because the Supreme Court would say, we have this little thing called the Second Amendment that says you can't write that law. The Supreme Court has the right to look at the laws that the legislative branch writes and say, nope, not today. It's their job as the Supreme Court to look at that. Because if we didn't have that option, the Supreme Court didn't have that option, then we would be back at what we just described. You can write anything. Write any law they wanted, as long as they can get reelected. And then say, hey, I'm not going to get reelected for another 2 years. I can write any law they want. However, the Supreme Court reviews those laws, judicial review. And there is a very specific case law that if I were you, I would write down that gave them that right. Because the Congress wasn't really keen on being checked initially. Nobody wants to be told what to do, right? Nobody wants to have answer to their supervisor or answer to somebody. But the Supreme Court heard a case and determined, no, we have the right to review these laws. Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison ensured that the Supreme Court gave the right, or was given the right to review laws to ensure constitutionality, and that's their job today.
But that's the one that also gave them the power to what they say can be checked and balanced. They gave the Supreme Court got, they have a way where they could, what they say goes.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything in Marbury v. Madison that talked about that specifically, but there are protections in place for the Supreme Court to ensure that they're not swayed. One of those protections is a lifetime appointment, but that's for all federal judges.
Mm-hmm.
By being appointed for life, you don't have to worry about making decisions that are unpopular and being kicked out of office. There are ways that Supreme Court justices can be removed from office. You can't just be, I mean, we're all humans. So at some point, you have to be able to recognize malfeasance, misconduct, things like that. So we can impeach a sitting justice. I don't think there's any examples of that being done. If it is, it's awfully obscure. But merely just being unpopular and fired because we have a new president, doesn't happen. So equal protection we talked about. The 14th Amendment giving granting citizenship. One of the questions that came up was, it was either in week 3 or is it this week? We talked about affirmative action. That last week or this week?
That's this week.
This week, so we're Monday, so you probably haven't done that yet. What is that? What is affirmative action?
Just making sure that minorities are able to get the same. As everybody else.
Give it equal access?
Yeah.
It's a controversial subject for a few reasons. But yeah, the idea of if folks have not been given a fair shot previously, then perhaps they need a more fair shot now. We need to repair those wrongs. One of the examples I was given when I heard somebody discussing this, and I'd never actually thought of it like this, because the argument against affirmative action is, this is not my problem. Why am I being, why aren't I being given treatment as equal as others? I never owned any slaves. My father never owned any slaves. Things like that. We heard arguments like that in the past, right? Our country has assets and liabilities. One of those liabilities is we treated some folks in a pretty horrible manner. And then even after slavery was abolished, we're still treating folks in a pretty horrible manner. That's why the 14th Amendment was necessary to provide slavery. Near after that, 100 years later, from the 1860s to the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement, folks were still being treated in a pretty horrible manner. We still had segregation, disparate treatment under the law. We wouldn't need a civil rights movement if things were hunky-dory. So the example that I used, that I heard somebody explain was, in that same vein of, I didn't own, it's not my problem, it's not fair, I didn't own any slaves, why am I being treated differently? The example they used was a CEO. Imagine yourself as a CEO coming into a company, brand new. Old CEO's fired or quit, retired, whatever. You're brand new, first day on the job, and you say, bring me the books, bring me the ledgers, I want to see our profit and earnings statements. And you start looking and you realize, okay, we're making this much money. That's great. Then you start looking at the bills every month. We're like, oh, we bought a building, so our mortgage is this month. We bought a bunch of furniture, and our payment each month for all this furniture is this much. And then we hired a bunch of people on a 5-year contract last year, so we have to have all these payroll. This is how much we owe every single month, and this is how much we make. I like this. I like how much we're making here. But to be honest, I didn't hire these people, and I never bought this building. I didn't buy that furniture. That's not my problem.
But you inherited the problem.
So it's not my problem. I'm not going to pay those bills.
I'm working.
Doesn't.
No.
Package deal. You get the benefits, you get the liabilities. And that's how I heard somebody explain that when it comes to affirmative action. Yeah. You didn't buy the mortgage, or you didn't sign the mortgage, but it's yours as a country. Now, regardless of your thoughts on the benefits of affirmative action type laws, that is an interesting perspective, and while arguable on both sides, I thought it was a very astute and lucid way of describing the bills that a country has, or as opposed, similarly to the bills that a company would have. If you inherit problems, you inherit bills, they still got to be paid even if you didn't sign the mortgage. Any thoughts on that example? Now, that is not to say that even though we have equal protection when it comes to hiring, employment, equal employment opportunity, EEO type laws in place, not every state has to abide by these affirmative action type laws. States can't outlaw them, and there's no penalty for a state doing it. A state can say, we're not going to enact affirmative action. But it has been found that it is not unlawful to enact. Not required, but allowed. Other equal protections under the law. We have several classes of protected persons. We talk about race, I think in this class, thus far in the last hour, I think race has probably been the most common. But we have what are some other protected classes under our law? If it's not race, what else?
Gender.
Gender, absolutely. Were all women allowed to vote when the Constitution was
No.
enacted? No. Well, but once the Bill of Rights was enacted, then all women could vote, right?
No, well,
No. Even then, even we talked about, we got rid of slavery, but 100 years later, we're still having the civil rights movement. We got rid of we realized, oh, shoot, we forgot to give all these equal protections. So let's write the Bill of Rights. And then, okay, now we got the Bill of Rights. Now everybody's taken care of. I mean, except for the slaves. Well, except for women. But everybody else. What does that leave? If we're not protecting the slaves, we're not protecting women. Who is being protected? White men. Yeah. That's a limited amount, a small window of the population, I'm sure. So there's a term that you should probably know called suffrage. That was a movement that involved giving women the right to vote. Don't conflate that with the word suffer. I know it sounds a lot alike. In fact, there's some funny videos out there that where folks would go up and ask women to sign a petition saying, hey, we want to get rid of women's suffrage. And women, some folks are like, yeah, that's a good idea. We don't want women's suffrage. Let's get rid of that women's suffrage.
We don't want those suffrage.
No, if you got rid of women's suffrage, it means you get rid of the women's right to vote. Just strange word. So you probably want to be, I imagine, against women's suffering, but for women's suffrage or anybody's suffrage. Usually, I don't think I've ever heard that term without the word woman in front of it, but I imagine just the term itself, somebody has the right to vote. But I've never heard of like racial suffrage or just men's suffrage. It's almost always you hear women's suffrage. What else? Gender, and as we go along, gender identity, handicap, disability, I should say not handicap, disabilities. Not only gender identity, but sexual identity. Remember, we'll take for instance, so I was in the military. When I was in the military, it was absolutely illegal to be homosexual. Absolutely illegal. Kicked out if you're homosexual. Now, there was a little bit of a compromise that I heard over here, don't ask, don't tell. How's that different than being illegal?
Yes, if we don't know, we can't.
Previously, you could ask, are you homosexual? Yeah, get out. Don't ask, don't tell meant just that. Couldn't ask. However, what's the other half of that? Because there's don't tell. So if you did tell, get out. Right. It's not just don't ask. It was don't ask, don't tell. So if I were in the military and decided that I was going to disclose my sexual orientation and the side that was unlawful, in this case, homosexuality being unlawful, then out of job. On top of that, there's laws in the books, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Sodomy was unlawful against the codified law. Sodomy, male or female. There's no differentiation in the law. Unnatural sex, unlawful. You could be prosecuted, in theory, you could be prosecuted for it. So that was not long ago. When I was in the military, it's not that long ago. Things have changed now, but just in that short time, there was a lot less protection. And that was the compromise where folks were happy, like, okay, well, at least we have don't ask, don't tell. But is that really fair to not be able to, maybe the don't ask part is fair.
To be yourself.
I mean,
You can get behind the don't ask part, like you don't need to ask. But the don't tell part of don't ask, don't tell is a little strange. What's that?
But so many people were in that talk for such a long time because it was looked down upon anyway, so would that have mattered to somebody in the city?
I imagine, even though
You have to
I,
go out
people have
broadcasting.
the right,
Right.
regardless of whether or not they want, it's somebody's right whether or not they want to express themselves. If they don't want to, then that's on them. That's the part of the don't ask. You can't make me answer, but to be told that you can't tell is a horse of a different color.
I mean, that's what the families were doing at that point.
That's it.
The families?
You're right, the families were behind you and they were telling you how to tell, like, men were
Right.
ashamed of having those kind of sexual sons, like.
I can't speak to what it was like, having not walked a mile in those shoes. I mean, I was in the military, but it wasn't a concern for me, or not, it wasn't a concern, it wasn't a life I had to live. I didn't know that experience. You know, prejudices versus discrimination, thoughts versus actions. You can have prejudiced thoughts against somebody and never act on them. In order to discriminate, you have to actually physically do something, not offer benefits, not offer a job, remove somebody from a job, things like that. What about racial profiling and racial bias policing, things like that? Obviously a hot button topic now, and unlawful, not the right thing to do. But we've talked about it a few times, and I like pressing this button home as far as using these protected classes as a method of enforcement. I proposed this question before, and I'll do it again. Are we allowed to use, let's use the most obvious one called racial profiling. Any discrimination is unlawful, but we'll talk about racial discrimination. Are we allowed to use race as a factor when making enforcement decisions? I know you've heard that question before. The answer hasn't changed.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And if you haven't heard that question before and it strikes a chord with you, it makes you think, wait a minute, I thought racial profiling was unlawful. Is using race as a factor to decide enforcement behaviors racial profiling? No. Racial profiling is using that, or bias policing is using that race solely as a factor. The extreme example I use is if 3 female Hispanics commit a robbery, and you're looking for the suspects of that robbery, and you see a male white walking down the sidewalk. 3 female Hispanics commit a robbery, and they were driving a blue Toyota Tercel, and then you see 30 seconds later a male white walking down the street. Do you think that male white is the one who committed the robbery?
No.
In part, is it because he's not Hispanic? Yeah, in part. What are some other reasons why you don't think he did it? He was walking, he wasn't in a Toyota Tercel. He's a male, and there's only one of them. Now, are you a racist cop if you don't stop that white guy because you used race as part of your decision? No. It is lawful to use race as a deciding factor for enforcement behavior. However,
If you saw that white guy with the Hispanic person, and the cops stop him, that's racial profiling.
well, we could change that around and say, hey, I just don't like white guys. And say, I'm gonna stop that. I'm gonna find a reason to stop that guy. Then, now you're using it solely as a protected class as a reason to stop. So, we've talked in the past about the idea of the prevalence of bias policing and the lack of evidence of it. A lot of folks talk about and imagine that there are these conversations in the black and white police car that say, oh, there's a certain demographic, let's stop them. Do we think that occurs?
Of course it occurs.
Why don't we have evidence of that? With the proliferation of body cameras and audio tapes inside cars, I have yet to, in the, 3 million law enforcement contacts a year. Over the last 10 years, that's 30 million law enforcement contacts. I haven't seen one audio tape, one videotape of that conversation. Why haven't we seen that?
Usually as an officer, though, you're supposed to ride with your partner, you really don't question them until after the situation happens anyway.
You don't think one time that conversation's happened?
I didn't say it didn't happen, I just.
Why don't we have evidence of it then?
They're videotaping them while in the car, they haven't, I mean, this videotaping, they're doing it now, and it wasn't done before.
So I'm going to propose a different scenario, a different twist on bias policing that maybe a different, an eye-opening shift. So you have this idea, the idea that you got racist officers who are outright deciding, I don't like the people in that car right there. Let's stop them only for that reason. There are folks that absolutely subscribe to the idea that occurs all the time. What if bias policing was this? What if there are two cars? One has opposing demographics. You got males and females. They're both speeding. And in your mind, you can only stop, or literally, you can only stop one. And in your mind, you choose car number A. And every time you're posed with that scenario, males and females, you always stop this one. Is that the same as, oh, there's a car full of X, let's stop. As opposed to there are two cars, I'm just going to choose to stop the one. Is that still bias? Do you think that's a more realistic explanation of bias policing? The idea that I'm sure it happens, but I'd be anxious. I don't understand why. If it does happen so often, I don't know why I haven't heard that tape yet, because the cars are being auto-taped and the body cams are there. That should have blown up on the 6 o'clock news if those conversations are occurring. By now, 30 million law enforcement contacts in the last 10 years. Why haven't I heard one audio taped conversation of that? If it's so prolific, if you're so willing to say, yeah, that's happening all the time. I haven't heard it seen. I haven't heard it one time, but I do know that the explanation of if you see two and you choose to lawfully, now I remember my story, they're both speeding. It wasn't, I'm going to stop this car for no reason. It was, these two cars are both committing violations of the law. I just chose to enforce the law on this one.
Why?
Well, why?
Probably because that car was closer
Why?
or.
A ton of explanations, sure.
Any number of explanations.
Absolutely. But I would submit to you as an alternative explanation to bias policing that could also occur. Now, the other is quite possibly occurring as well. But one, I just wanted to give you a different scenario, a different opportunity to see what bias policing looks like versus let's stop that car for no reason. It could be that car is breaking the law, but we just chose not to stop this one. We chose to stop this one. Yes, ma'am.
Audio in the sector cars is new to me. I didn't know that they had audio. How long have they had the audio in this?
It depends on the jurisdiction, depends on what they can afford. Audio in the car, I don't know about every jurisdiction, it's being more and more prolific. Yeah. Do you think it's fair?
I don't think, no, they shouldn't be policed. That's the police. They shouldn't be policed that way, but.
I mean, there are limits to it. It's not being, in my experience, the conversations in the car are not 100% recorded and memorialized because things like when you turn the lights on will lock in the last 3 minutes of conversation in the car, things like that. Because otherwise, if we record the car the entire time, it is a little bit of infringement. Did those officers sign up to have their liberties taken away?
Of course you did, when you took.
Yeah, that's right. I agree
In the
with that.
military, for sure. And as a government employee,
It's the same oath.
it's the same oath, but it's not the same job.
It's the same oath.
If I didn't go to work in the military, I go to jail. If I don't go to work in the
That's apples and
LAPD,
oranges. We're talking about
Yeah.
civil liberties here. We're talking about certain liberties. In the military, I couldn't say half the things that I say now.
absolutely.
And being a cop, you couldn't say half the things that you say in your personal life.
But the difference is the penalty. One's an occupation, and absolutely, I agree. Even just government employees, not just law enforcement, I agree that you lose a lot of your civil liberties
Sure
being a
do.
government employee, and case law has borne that out.
That's what I didn't like. about
However,
the original.
There is an organization that actually argued against law enforcement officers being recorded 24 hours, or not 24 hours, the entire time in the car. So there's an organization that defends civil liberties of not just offenders, it's the public, the ACLU. The ACLU oftentimes has this image of being anti-police, sometimes anti-law enforcement, because there's so much defending liberties of those folks that are accused. However, in this case, the ACLU supported the decision to not record law enforcement officers inside the car because they believed it was against their civil liberties. Law enforcement officers should be afforded the opportunity to, as they described it, discuss the politics of their organization. Discuss the politics. What is that a nice way of saying? Discussing the politics of your organization. Yeah, talking smack. You should be able to talk smack about your supervisor without your supervisor recording your hearing it.
I've been talking back.
So, interesting idea. So, but yes, they're not recorded, in my experience, they're not recorded the entire time. However, there is more and more usage of those. And I would be anxious to find out if we ever do hear a conversation like that. It is so held so true as a belief that there are officers stopping somebody for no reason so often. At some point, we should hear a conversation discussing it. We haven't yet. So I propose to you that perhaps that second scenario that I showed is maybe a more realistic, or at least an alternative scenario. Yes, sir.
Have you ever tried to access this public record, video and recording of police? Have you ever actually tried? Of course, it'd be easier for you because you're on the job, but.
Right. I've had that. As a supervisor, I had access to all video, but I haven't done it since.
Is your average person doing the FOIA?
No.
Tape, money, we'll get it to you, it's still under, it's.
Some organizations are far more transparent, especially because the idea that the tapes are evidentiary in value, and so that it's hard to release. Whereas, like Los Angeles Police Department will release it, I believe it's within 45 days of any significant incident. So if you go to the LAPD's YouTube channel, within 45 days of every officer involved shooting, you can watch on YouTube them shooting people. It'll be blurred out, and it gives a little background.
The whole video.
It'll be, yeah, they'll give a long, they're usually about 30 to 45 minutes long, I think, from my recollection. And you can, like I said, it's the LAPD's YouTube channel, and it has and I think about I mean, there's a lot of officer involved shootings, so about every week or two, they're releasing another one from 45 days ago. So if you're interested in seeing some of those specifically for the LAPD, check out their YouTube channel. It's open, you can subscribe to it. And the only difference is you can't. I think they turned off the comments. Any questions about what we talked about today?